So you were very involved in the Google-Verizon deal.
Yeah, we prefer to think of it as a legislative framework proposal, but yeah, I was one of the lead negotiators with Verizon.
It seems to me that a lot of the controversy actually comes down to a factual judgment that if one thinks that there is basically no hope for getting net neutrality because of just the way life is in Washington at the moment, and that there's no possibility of going forward, which is a sort of factual judgment, then compromising makes a ton of sense. But if you think that there's still room for negotiation and maybe we can nudge things this way or that, then the compromise looks like a premature act that will drive things in the wrong direction. So, what is your factual assessment of where we are in this process?
So I think that's a good way of thinking about it, is that the judgment call you make about whether the political situation in D.C. is so gridlocked that and that there was a window of opportunity to perhaps get something that could be moved in Congress this year and adopted into law versus waiting for something to happen some other time at the FCC or in Congress probably next year. Our assessment was this was the right time to try to do something. As you mentioned, compromise. Compromise in some quarters has a bad connotation. It suggests you're giving in on principles. In DC, of course, things you get accomplished are always a matter of compromise. You never get everything you want. And so we were trying to be pragmatic about the things we wanted, which was to protect the open internet, at least on the wireline side, and save for another day the issues around managed services and wireless. And so that was a judgment call. And I think it's fair for people to critique us as to whether that was the correct assessment for the time. At this point, it's not clear that we have found the traction we were looking for on the Hill with the proposal, but there still is some time left in this legislative session. So we remain cautiously optimistic that something good can come of it. And if nothing else, as Larry Page has said, after 5 years, we finally got people in Silicon Valley marching about net neutrality. We just hadn't expected to have them marching on our campus.
There's one area that seems to me not to be that it seems to be more about a change in principle than a compromise. Eric Schmidt, a few weeks ago, said, and it sounded to me as if he was saying, well, of course, and we've always believed that net neutrality permits discrimination based upon application type, so long as there's no discrimination within that application type. So it's okay for a carrier, an access provider, to allow, say, movie bits to go through quickly and shoulder aside other bits so long as one movie studio's movies are not being preferred. That sounded like a change to me, and it sounded like a real, I was very disappointed. It sounded like a new principle, not as a compromise.
So Eric has long had that view, and in fact the company's been talking about that for some 3 years. When I filed comments in 2007 at the FCC as part of Kevin Martin's initial inquiry on network neutrality or open internet, we called out this notion, what we call type-based prioritization, the notion that if there's certain types of applications that are uniquely sensitive to latency or jitter or other aspects in the network, as long as you're treating them all the same, and that if you wanted to do that and maybe charge an end user an extra amount of money on the the consumer side, say to make sure all their video shows up in the best possible condition, that would be an okay network management technique, but it would not be for commercial gain in terms of getting all of the video providers or all the VoIP providers or whoever else to pay the broadband company. So that's something we consistently said yes to. We said yes to it earlier in the year in our FCC comments, and it is part of the proposal with Verizon to allow this so-called type-based prioritization as the only exception to an otherwise a regime that says that prioritization is presumed to be unlawful.
Are you comfortable with that? Because it would mean that it seems extremely likely that the access providers would prioritize types based upon the revenue that they can extract from those types, so that we're likely to see access providers prioritize movie content over video games are trivial. Phone calls count. The latency in phone calls count, but the latency in video games doesn't, or in movies does or doesn't, or high-def TV gets priority because that extra high definition is especially important, and all those are reasonable arguments. Why on earth would we want to let the access providers make the decisions about priorities even among types?
Well, this is an area again for reasonable minds to differ. It's Eric's view that of course the networks have always been managed to some degree. So this concept that the network provider never manages anything, that they just allow the bits to go one way or another through the pipe, and it's all just kind of preset without any policy involved. I don't think is necessarily an accurate representation of what it is to route packets. In the company's view, this kind of prioritization would be acceptable because it's something that hopefully would benefit end users. They would get a better experience of the internet, and because it's done for objective network reasons, not for reasons of trying to make a ton load more money on the open internet. We think that that's a reasonable trade-off. This is one of the areas we think that having a technical advisory group, so kind of this group of engineers, broad-based independent organization of technical folks who are both from the broadband community as well as public interest representatives and others, to sit down and talk about whether and how these kinds of things can be allowed on the network and under what conditions. We think that's uniquely an important role for that kind of a body, rather than having the FCC, frankly, kind of putting rules out there, either saying you should ban all these types of things or allow all these types of things indiscriminately, that there may be some middle ground, some limiting factors you can put in place that benefits end users, but then also protects against incursions on the open internet.
Yeah, but still, whenever anybody here, I hear talking about a better experience of the internet, in the back of my head, I hear they're trying to turn it into TV. That's what their idea of a better experience is, and I suspect that's not true of Google, but I think it is true of.
Yeah, you say TV, we think of cable TV, right? So we are trying to avoid the channelization or videoization of the internet. So. So that's the thing that we are guarding against as best we think is possible. The proposal with Verizon, was a proposal. It was a way we were both giving on some ground here. Other folks, again, can disagree, and that's perfectly fine. If type-based prioritization as a network management technique causes people discomfort, then they should make sure the FCC and their members of Congress are well aware of that view, and have that incorporated into whatever framework may or may not be adopted in the coming months or years on net neutrality.
Just one other question, and this goes back to things that feel like principles and things that feel like compromises. The giving up, I know you will push back on this, but the apparent giving up on net neutrality for wireless felt like such a wholesale error. I mean, that's where the internet is going. Obviously, that's where that I was surprised at that.
So the give up part, I think, is not quite accurate. So we leave it to Congress, right? The notion here is Congress will figure out whether and how to impose requirements on the wireless broadband networks. There is a transparency requirement, which is not there today, which is not nothing. Beyond that, though, we had a judgment call to make. Again, a judgment call people can assess for themselves as to where we try to get the best possible deal on the table from Verizon. What's the best proposal we could come up with? And our thinking was we wanted to nail down the protections on the wireline best efforts internet side. That's where we really wanted to focus our firepower, get a standard that essentially says, unless there's a really good reason for it, prioritization of all forms for commercial gain or what have you, is to be deemed unlawful. And I think that's a pretty powerful thing to have one of the major broadband providers actually agree to, and then actually turn into terms of service on their website for all of their customers going forward. And that in exchange for that, we were willing to say wireless can be kind of kept over for another day. So we're not saying no, we're just saying not right now. Again, judgment call, people can certainly critique us on that, and I think there's certainly reasonable minds around that as well, but that was the way we thought would make the most sense, create the right precedent on wireline, have that entrenched in law, in statutes that cannot be overturned by the next FCC, for example, and then as wireless continues to evolve, keep a close eye on it, and then let's figure out how openness should be thought of in that context.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, David.